In this episode of Visual Studio Toolbox, we're going to see how you can easily set rules for your code and also format it to look pretty. Hi, welcome to Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm your host, Robert Green, and joining me today is Josh Goldberg. Hey, Josh.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And we're going to talk about using ESLint and Prettier, particularly in Visual Studio Code. And before we dive into that, tell us a little bit about yourself for those viewers who might not be familiar with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Josh. I'm a full-time open source maintainer and developer in the TypeScript ecosystem. So I work on free projects that help you write TypeScript code with less bug stuff and more stylistic consistency. So my goal is to make it easier for you to write good apps.
Awesome. I love that. Good apps are good.
Yeah, big fan.
So what does it mean to write good apps, in particular ESLint, Prettier? I've heard about these things, pretty code. Why do I care?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. A few reasons. There are a lot of different tools you can use to help yourself or your teammates, your team, write good code by some definition of the word good. Unit testing is a really common one that's quite popular. Prettier and ESLint are two common tools in the JavaScript TypeScript ecosystem that do two things separate from testing. ESLint lets you define a bunch of very specific lint rules that can find individual bad practices. Like if you have a variable that's never used, you can delete it, save some mental burden trying to read the code. And Prettier is a formatter, which allows you to auto-format your code. So instead of spending time hitting spaces and then screaming about tabs with your coworkers, you can just let the magic happen automatically and save yourself the time and pain.
Cool. Wow, that sounds interesting. I'm sold. How do they work? Let's see them.
Ooh. Well, that's a great cue. There we go. So in here, I have a few files open. On the left, we have greet.ts, which is just a standard TypeScript file. And then on the right side, I've got my ESLint config, which is quite large. This is my personal one. A lot of repos tend to have much smaller. And then I have my Prettier config. So what I've done for this repo, which we can say is the way I like doing things, is I've set up VS Code settings to make it so all this stuff happens as automatically as possible. I've set it up so that every time I save, I format, and then I set the default formatter to be the Prettier extension. So if I were to, I don't know, like add a bunch of spaces and, I don't know, like do some weird stuff here, I'm going to hit Command or Control S on my keyboard and voila, it automatically saves for me.
Okay.
Pretty useful. But ESLint is a little bit more capable than that. ESLint finds individual problems. So like, let's say if I were to have an unused parameter here, like, I don't know, extra message string. And then I were to run pnpm lint on my command line or npm run lint or whatever package manager you prefer. After a few moments, ESLint will ... give me a complaint saying error extra message is defined but never used. And we're actually at this really fun place in the ESLint ecosystem where we're migrating to a new config format. So if I fix a little bug in my config here, we can actually get little red or yellow squigglies in the editor saying what the actual complaint is. In this case, extra message is defined but never used, reported both by TypeScript and ESLint.
Cool.
Makes sense? Sound good so far?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So one of the big benefits, one of the big advantages of TypeScript is that it's not just the syntax. It's not just variables, functions, even syntax for declaring what your types of things are. Like this options is either this greet options or a string. TypeScript also provides a really nice set of APIs that allow tools to make really informed decisions about code. For example, let's say you were to have a function that's async and you were to await console.log. Hello. Fun fact about this, if you await something in JavaScript that isn't thenable, like a promise, nothing happens. It just wastes a little bit of time in your code. So we have a lint rule in TypeScript ESLint, one of the projects I work on, that says, hey, if you await something that's not a promise, not a thenable, we'll let you know. We'll give you the little squigglies in your editor. And we can even suggest that you remove the unnecessary awaits. We can suggest the fix in your code for you.
Oh, cool.
And that's only possible because of TypeScript. Because if you have some value somewhere that's some function, we need to use the type system to understand what is this thing's actual type. Is it a function that returns void? Is it a promise? Is it what? So that's a really powerful deduction that can be made in code once you use ESLint and TypeScript together.
Mm-hmm.
I also see that we have
ESLint, is that an extension? Is that just something you declare? How do you actually get that? Is it there by default?
Great question. VS Code ships with TypeScript by default, but it does not ship with ESLint. TypeScript, for those who haven't had the pleasure, is a open source programming language released by Microsoft, who also makes VS Code, so they're very nicely integrated. But ESLint is a community open source project. There's no one company behind it. So you can get an ESLint extension for VS Code. If you look up in extensions, ESLint, it's actually created by Microsoft, the extension, but not ESLint itself. Shout out to the VS Code team. And if you want to use ESLint locally, you have to configure it with an ESLint config file. And I have one of the more obnoxiously large config files here because I've pulled in all sorts of different plugins from all over the ecosystem. I pulled in one that I know a lot of people will hate, but I just love this thing called Perfectionist that enforces that your objects have sorted properties, which is a very, love or hate kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the nice thing about ESLint is that because it's so configurable, because there's so many different plugins, you can make it do whatever it is that you really need it to do. I have things saying like, if I have a function that is async, but doesn't need to be, doesn't have any awaits, it gives me that complaint. Or if I have, let's say, options, a param that says options, the options, well, I'll get a little complaint here saying, let's see, param options, pardon me. I'll get a little complaint here saying this tag description only repeats the name it describes. Because I don't know about you, but the options is not a particularly useful, description of this parameter. So yeah, ESLint, just to recap, is a standalone open source project that has really nice integrations for editors like VS Code that you can opt into.
And are any of these complaints, are they like in Visual Studio, you can configure whether something prohibits you from building, just gives you a warning? Can you set the... I know there's a word I'm looking for. Help me out.
Severity level, builds level.
Thank you.
Yes. So one of the key differences between VS Code and something more rich and full like Visual Studio itself is that Visual Studio Code's a little more lightweight. It doesn't have as much built in. So you can do a lot of the same things as Visual Studio, but a lot of it's actually moved over to a settings.json file. And a few of the options you can have in your settings.json file is eslint.rules.customizations, which says, instead of showing me the actual squiggly color corresponding to whether it's a warning or error, let's say you want to downgrade them all to warning. That's really nice because if you have a TypeScript complaint, let's say you have like hello.this is wrong, you can have the TypeScript complaints visually show as red. Whereas the ESLint ones, even though on the command line they'll be red, exit with status code 1, visually they will show as, let's say, warnings or info. But if you have any kind of build setup, like let's say you're using, I don't know what people use, Vite or Webpack or all sorts of fun things like NX and Turbo. Yeah, by default, most project starters don't have ESLint fail the build because that's really annoying. But you can opt into failing the build if you really want. Like I know Vercel's Next.js by default does, and you have to opt out.
Okay, cool. And then you can also do linting in Visual Studio. I know that it's got support for that. So for the Visual Studio folks amongst us, understand that what Josh is showing completely applies to us as well. We just have a little different mechanism for it.
Yes.
All right.
No, I used to be a Visual Studio developer back in the day. I miss that IDE. It's a good product.
Well, I'm primary Visual Studio, but I do a lot of code as well. I think a lot of people go back and forth or use both depending on their needs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So one thing that I'd like to answer, by the way, before we dive into something else is I touched on earlier that ESLint and Prettier are two different tools. ESLint is a linter. Linters have a bunch of discrete rules. Each rule does one thing and does it well, whereas the formatter just applies formatting. The two are not the same. ESLint is not particularly good as a formatter because if you had each rule applying each formatting style you wanted, they would take a while and conflict with each other. So this is actually kind of a recent development in the JavaScript community, that for years and years, we kind of used the two terms linting and formatting interchangeably. And now we've kind of figured out that, okay, they're really different. And I realize how few people probably care about what I just said, but it makes me happy that we've really solidified what these tools are supposed to do.
Yep, cool.
Cool.
All right. Is that it for ESLint?
Yeah, I think that's about it. That's all I really had to show. Cool.
Okay, let's see. Let's talk about Prettier a little bit more.
Sure. So Prettier is the formatter, and you can also configure it. You don't have to. By default, Prettier will just run with the default settings. I personally prefer tabs, so I've enabled in my Prettier config file use tabs. Much like ESLint, Prettier can be configured with plugins. So here I've configured two of them. One of them, Prettier plugin Curly, enforces that if I have a statement or a block that could have brackets here, the little brackets, it will.
Oh, okay.
Because I personally find it confusing when it's inconsistent whether you use the block brackets. And I also have one called Prettier plugin package JSON, which will sort the keys in my package JSON, which I realize is even more nitpicky than all the stuff I've shown so far. But I find to be quite useful for, being able to quickly scan through and expect a consistent order.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's Prettier. Not as deep of an area here. We're not pulling into the TypeScript type checker to make deductions about the types of code. But because, again, I saved in my VS Code /settings.json, I've set my default formatter to be Prettier, and I've formatted on save. It runs automatically.
So if you don't format on save, how do you trigger a format?
You can manually format a file. I'm going to get TypeScript to stop screaming at me in my Greek file. So let's say that I'm going to save without formatting here, which is a VS Code little command you can do. Prettier, by default, when it runs, will trim down multiple consecutive blank lines to just one. So I can do format document, which, by the way, is Control-Shift-P to get this nice command window on Windows, Command-Shift-P on Mac. I'm going to do format document to run it automatically for me.
Cool. And then because it's set up in the settings, then Visual Studio Code knows to run that.
Yeah. Visual Studio Code allows you to register multiple potential formatters and then set the default one. But if I, let's say, wanted to format document with, I don't know, the default TypeScript one, which is a little less comprehensive, a little less opinionated, I could do that too. And we'll see that it doesn't trim down those extra lines, but it did just remove a bunch of empty spaces that I had on that one line.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So those look pretty easy to use. I'm sure you can get, as you showed us, pretty complex in your rules, but it's just there. Seems to be working nice.
Yeah. A few little miscellaneous tips for folks. I also like to use a tool called Husky with a tool called Lint Staged in my TypeScript, JavaScript projects. Husky allows you to register Git hooks, so little commands that get run whenever you, say, make a new commit or push. And I use Lint Staged to run something on the files that are being staged in Git. And what I'm saying here in my package JSON is for every file, asterisk, I'm going to run Prettier. I'm going to ignore unknown files if it's some weird format Prettier doesn't understand. And I'm going to rewrite the file. So even if I were to use Notepad++ or the newly improved Notepad in Windows 11 instead of VS Code or VS, I would still be getting auto-formatted files once they are committed in Git. And I have found that that's quite useful if I'm playing around with VS Code or just need to do some quick changes.
So as a tip, this just occurred. Let's say you and I are working on a project. You use Prettier rigorously. I can't be bothered. So you check into GitHub, nice, perfectly formatted code. I download it and I mess up all the nice, pretty formatting because I don't care. and then the next time you sync the code, all your pretty formatting is going to go out the window and you need to do it again. Does that happen? And if so, what are your tips and tricks for avoiding that? Because I could see that winding up in yelling and screaming and controversy.
I remember my last team when I was at Microsoft, we never resolved the debate of whether we should enforce formatting with Prettier or to what level with Linting.
Okay.
So first of all, there's a political and interpersonal problem there that you two, or you and I, have clearly not seen eye to eye on what to do with this dev tooling stuff. And we should probably talk like humans and figure it out. But you raise a good point. That happens a lot. So two answers. One, the thing I just showed, the Git hook. Let's say that I save without formatting. Let's make a Git branch, Git checkout, B temp, Git add all, Git commit M. This will format. We see that it runs. Pardon me as I mess with security. But okay, you can actually ignore the thing, the Git hook I just showed if you really want. So you can do Git commit M. This will not format, -- no verify.
Mm-hmm.
So notice it was much faster by a second. And so that's unfortunate. What most teams do to avoid this kind of thing, beyond talking to each other like humans, is they'll set up something in CI and continuous integration. For example, GitHub Actions. Let's see. I never remember what I call these things. Prettier.yaml. So here I'm saying every pull request
cool.
commit,
Okay.
I'm going to PNPM format list different, which means it'll fail the build if I have not correctly formatted files.
Okay. Is there a way to apply the formatting as part of the GitHub action ahead of time?
Yes, but it's surprisingly hard to get this right. Because let's say you're working on a professional team. A lot of teams do configure it so that, and there are a lot of GitHub action presets for this, where, okay, if the formatting's wrong, just commit it to the branch on GitHub, and then whoever's running it or working locally can pull that branch. But if you're working with someone who's not familiar with Git, or maybe they are, but they forgot that happens, and then they have commits locally that are a diversion history from the upstream or the main, the origin.
Mm-hmm.
It gets a little tricky. So I personally don't use those by default in my open source repos, but what you just suggested is a good idea and can be done.
Okay. Cool. But it's probably a good thing as you're on a project to have certain standards that people adhere to, right? I mean, there's coding conventions, there should be linting and formatting conventions. So it's probably best agreed on as just what we do on this project.
Yeah. I think that for many years, most developers typically didn't care very much about linting or formatting because honestly, a lot of the rules are very nitpicky. Should you use, function expressions or function declarations, like stuff that A, no one cares about the terminology, and B, it doesn't actually benefit the project. But now that we have really quick formatters like Prettier, there's also like Biome and Deepprint and others in the ecosystem, we've found that the actual user benefits to developers of saving time, not having to scream about little nitpicky preferences, actually make teams more efficient.
Yeah.
And similarly with linting, even ignoring all the wonderful bug catching rules, like the ones that'll verify you're doing promises correctly and all this, just having a standard naming convention removes the mental burden of having to figure it out for yourself and then learn everyone else's unique conventions depending on which file or files you're looking at. So as annoying as it is to have to discuss whether you want 2 spaces or 4 or whatever, there are real benefits to developers and their teams from this stuff.
Yep. And then the idea of alphabetizing properties. That one we'll discuss. We would discuss that one over a lunch or coffee or something.
Yeah, preferably a team would not jump into that if they've never used linting before. But if you're like me and you work in this stuff day to day, there is a certain beauty in having a completely alphabetized, 15 property object. It makes me happy.
Yep. And I like to group properties, like in XAML, I like to group in a particular order, and I like the alignments are in one place, the margins are in another place, and so I wouldn't necessarily want them alphabetized because I want horizontal alignment right next to vertical alignment because it's about alignment. But now it's just personal preference. So
Yeah. And actually, I think you bring up a really good point that I think I should talk on, which is you can disable all of this stuff.
Mhm.
For ESLint, for example, I as one of the people who works on this stuff have a whole bunch of rules that I've just turned off. I recommend commenting why these on by default ones don't work well, or these ones need to be reconfigured to be less aggressive or more
Oh, okay.
aggressive, which you
Cool.
can do. A lot of rules have options,
Yep.
like ignore this or allow that.
Right.
You can also ESLint disable. Here we go. ESLint disable for a block or for a single line of code. For example, there's a TypeScript feature called a non-null assertion that we lint against by default. But if you know you really want to use it, if TypeScript just can't figure out what you're doing, nothing stops you from putting an ESLint disable and making ESLint shut up for a line or two.
Very cool. All right. This is awesome. Thanks so much for coming on and showing us these things.
I love how one of the more enthusiastic moments for you was me showing how to turn everything off. That I'm going to have to process that emotionally.
No. I was more excited about how easy it is to start doing it.
I'm glad. I'm glad. And for anyone who's looking at this stuff and having a hard time, I work on the ESLint and the TypeScript ESLint teams. Please, if you're having a hard time, if there are features or missing docs you'd like to see improved, let us know. We're all open source. We're all happy to receive your feedback.
Cool. And we'll put some good links in the show notes. And again, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Hope you guys enjoyed that. And we will see you next time on Visual Studio Toolbox.